Now.
On 105.9 FM and streaming worldwide on the WMAL app.
O'Connor and Company.
Good morning. It is 8:37. If you missed any of this broadcast, check out our podcast on our website. We're doing our best to keep a smile on your face, and we're charging through it. I am Julie Gunlock, sitting in for Larry alongside Hans von Spakovsky. Good morning, Hans.
Good morning, Julie. I made it into the last half hour, didn't I?
I love how you kind of act like you're just surviving a tough morning. Joining us now is our friend Luke Rosiak, investigative reporter at the Daily Wire. Good morning, Luke.
Good morning.
So you have a story out. You're writing about DOGE is pushing to make federal workers return to work. Look, Luke, I have worked from home for years. I know I just was on Twitter, and one of our listeners was saying how helpful it is for him and his family to work from home. It's popular to work from home, but through your writing and your investigation, you found some pretty alarming numbers about this sort of work from home arrangements in the federal government. Tell us about that.
Yeah, so Senator Joni Ernst, who's chairwoman of the DOGE caucus in the Senate, put out this report working with inspectors general to look at how the federal government is working from home. And she basically found that they can't make up their mind. They're maintaining all these buildings. They're spending $16 billion a year maintaining these headquarters. But at the same time, almost everybody's working from home. So these buildings have an occupancy rate of 12%. The Social Security Administration recently renovated its building for $120 million. The building is 91% empty. God. And they just signed a contract with the union locking in telework until 2029. So I work from home, too. I think it can be good for a lot of people, but it doesn't really make sense to do both of these things, to spend all this money maintaining headquarters and then not having anyone use them. And then there's also a lot of evidence in this report that while in the private sector people may work from home in certain jobs just fine, the government doesn't always operate that way. There's a lot of people that may be slacking off, and there's no real oversight. And there's no, profit incentives. The mechanisms are different in the government that make it a little easier for people to get away with kind of not doing anything when they work from home. Whereas in the private sector, you may be able to work from home just fine, and if you're not, your boss is going to know it and he's going to fire you.
Yeah, I mean, if you don't show the productivity in the private sector, you're not going to keep that job. Whereas as a former federal employee in two different federal agencies, I think everybody knows once you're a career civil servant, you can basically not do your job. You can engage in the just worst things, and the chances of you're getting fired are pretty much nil. It's almost impossible to fire someone, even when you know they're not competent at their job.
Yeah, I mean, there was a guy at Social Security Administration who, for 3 years, he was running a home inspection business while he was working for Social Security remotely. So he was out in the field going to everybody's houses, and he would just have his mom send an email once in a while from his Social Security account, and that was enough to make people think that he was working full-time. And meanwhile, you've got Social Security, elderly and disabled people having a hard time getting services sometimes. And so Joni Ernst is suggesting that maybe this is why. And she goes through a lot of metrics where the government is not serving people well. You fire off an email to some government bureaucrat and you don't hear back for 2 months. Is that because they're not really working that hard when they're working remotely? Because something's got to explain why it takes two months to get a return email. A couple other examples of just how crazy it is to maintain all these buildings. The head of the General Services Administration, whose job it is to maintain all these buildings, works from home. And then the EPA, whose job it is to make sure we have safe drinking water, its own drinking water in its own headquarters was actually poisonous because it was just sitting stagnant in the pipes for so long.
Well, Luke,
then finally you have FDA inspectors inspecting food facilities over video chat. So it really raises the question of whether we're putting government employees' convenience over American safety when it comes to getting these services that presumably they think are important, because that's why we have these agencies.
Well, I think that there is a case to be made here, despite being a big fan of work from home. And part of the reason is I think that it makes it a lot easier. Women in particular really prefer to have more flexibility in the workforce, and I think that work from home options really are good, and it really attracts women back into the, if they choose to. But for me, I was able to work and also stay home with my kids, and that was only possible because of work from home. But how much of an appetite will there be on Capitol Hill to really look into this? I remember Matthew Foldy, friend of the show, doing a big investigation right after COVID, where he would go up on Capitol Hill, and it was obvious that these senators and congressmen had not been to their offices for months. There was mail piled up outside. And so, congressmen and senators also enjoy these arrangements. How much of an appetite will there be for some of these DOGE initiatives when it might hurt them as well?
Well, I think that, the people that are public, I think Congress is back. I think that the high-level employees are back. But there's this weird thing where, like, the VA advertises on its website, at the VA you can break away from the traditional 9-to-5, 40-hour work week without sacrificing the opportunities and benefits that come with job security. So they're saying you're going to have the pension, you're going to have the difficulty to fire me, but I also don't have to come into work, and I don't even have to work 40 hours a week. And normally that was the trade-off, is you do get the pension, but you do have to show up and sit in the office. And, at the VA, there was a suicide hotline that a third of the calls were just not being answered.
Oh,
so these are potentially life-threatening. The fact that if these employees aren't working that hard, people could die.
Yeah.
And so, another thing is during COVID, the government actually hasn't tracked remote workers they haven't put much effort into making sure they're actually working. One of the times they did it was during the pandemic. The Health and Human Services Department looked, and only a third of the remote employees were even logging into their email on a typical day. And so this is during COVID. And so it's like, well, if you guys are the health department and we have this pandemic, I mean, do you guys even think your agency is that important? Do you guys even think your job is essential? Because it's essentially fraud. And the fact that nobody noticed they didn't log in at all, even though remote work, I think, works out very well for a lot of people, that just can't be tolerated. I agree with you about the woman angle, but one woman, I think, who is going to be happy if Elon Musk and Donald Trump bring all these people back is Muriel Bowser. It's gonna really resurrect the economy of DC.
Maybe then they'll start paying for Metro. Luke, we gotta keep it there. This is great reporting. I hope you'll come back and update on this really important issue for this region.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks. It's 8:44 on WMAL.